To help us defeat the Colorado hunting ban, go to SaveTheHuntColorado.com and check out the raffles. There's a mountain lion hunt and taxidermy raffle and a Gunworks rifle package. Also, make sure that you subscribe to this podcast, and thanks for listening.
Dan Gates.
Appreciate the opportunity. We got a little bit of a time difference between the two of us, but we're both up and around, and I think I'm pretty spry this morning. So,
yeah, that's great. We've both been up pretty early. I'd say just to start, because a lot of the people that listen to this podcast are East Coast people who may not even be aware of what's going on. Why don't you do a quick intro and then tell us, what's happening in Colorado and even before that, maybe how we got there from the standpoint of the changing demographic of the state and how you ended up where you are right now.
Well, the first thing that's going to be hard to do is you said do a quick intro, because if we go all the way back to when this stuff
forget
started.
Forget the quick intro. Let's just roll.
So I'm Dan Gates. I'm the current executive director of the Coloradans for Responsible Wildlife Management. And that's an organization that a buddy of mine and I started 7 years ago. And it's a 501c4 organization, which allows us to do political advocacy and campaign type stuff, along with education, primarily education, with the other stuff coupled into that. Most of the acronym groups on the landscape that I've talked about many, many times are 501c3s, and they can't necessarily do what we do. And they haven't changed their model over the last 40 years, but they're starting to come around because they see the need for further engagement and advocacy. I'm also the president for the Colorado Trappers and Predator Hunters Association, have been for the last 12 years. I run and operate a wildlife control business and have for 37 years. My son runs that with us, and we do human-animal conflict resolution. Everything from power plants to Department of Defense and utility structures and water treatment facilities, and just a variety of different things on a grand scale compared to where I started out at, trapping skunks and squirrels and doing some coyote damage work, 40 years ago. And so the organization, I don't very much, and taking melatonin helps when I do, but it does.
It's a magic.
You get in bed, and I got like a rat in a cage running around in my head most of the time. And if I'm not driving down the road or even on a podcast or a phone call or something, the rat's still going around. And we're dealing with stuff in Colorado over the last 30 some odd years, but it's really escalated in the last 6 because of a governor election that we had back in 2018. And while I'm not saying that we were ever perfect over the last 30 years, we had some improvements and some flags that were planted on the landscape and some lines that were drawn in the sand as far as conservation, hunting, and angling issues. And it was, Colorado has changed from a red to a purple to somewhat of a pink to a blue state. And now we got like 40 shades of blue. And the demographics have changed. Our population has grown substantially. The mentality and ideologies have changed, not so much from an anti perspective of anything, more from a ignorance, unaware campaign mentality that people just don't know. They move from Tennessee, or they move from California, they move from Texas or New York or wherever. They're not so sure, not so much the tradition and the heritage, but they don't know where our water comes from. And they don't know about natural resource conservation efforts. They don't know about wildlife. And so they're easily swayed to some degree. And when you get agenda-driven administrations like what we have now, with a plethora of animal rights activists and extremist organizations trying to take over, they have leaders in our capital at this point in time with the governor and the first gentleman, the two that are driving a lot of the driving force with this. And just be honest with you, I mean, we've been fighting these issues now hard for 6 years since Governor Polis took office in 2018. And it's culminating with things that they're not actually doing. And I want to emphasize, they're not doing these ballot initiatives, but they're setting the tone and the narrative for appointments,
right,
and for people in position and relationships and that sort of thing to help escalate and enhance this opportunity for agenda-driven mentalities. And now we have a ballot initiative to ban the harvest of mountain lions and bobcats. and leave it up to the general public to take a vote, after which we won at the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission on 3 consecutive times in 2019, 20, and 21. And then in 22, these same groups or organizations and individuals, to some degree, not all of them are involved in this, then they went to the General Assembly through the Capitol and ran a legislative bill, which we in turn defeated. And I want to emphasize, when we went through the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission, we won 11-0 with the governor's appointed commissioners. The next year, we won 11-0 with the governor's appointed commissioners. The next year, they withdrew the petition because they knew they were going to lose. And the following year, in February 22, they decided to go to the General Assembly because they found some legislators that were favorable for their ideologies. And they ran a bill, which we were told that we would be defeated on, and we won that. And their only other option at this point in time was to take advantage of the administration, what we would consider the lame duck term of a governor who terms out in 2026, and run a ballot thinking that they could turn around and take sound wildlife management and conservation efforts when it comes to big cat conservation off the table and put it back on the shelf in some sort of preserve, as opposed to try to conserve it.
So in terms of the way that Colorado has changed and the timeline of what that looks like, I think for most people that it's starting to become more apparent. But for people who live east of the Mississippi, when you think of Colorado, the uneducated person thinks about a state that is exactly what Colorado probably was 50 years ago, right? Very rich in wildlife. We think of people who are deeply ingrained in the culture of hunting and conservation and all the things that would stand for the West. But obviously, due to a lot of the growth in your urban populations, that's changed significantly. When did that start to happen, and when did you hit the tipping point where it really changed from what we think of Colorado as to what it is now?
Well, we had a ballot initiative in 1992. It was Initiative 10, and that actually took away spring bear hunting in any capacity, took the use of hounds, took the use of bait away, and then we were allowed a fall season for bear in September, from September 2nd to September 30th. And so that started in 92. Yeah. And then in 96, 4 years after that, we lost trapping, avocational trapping outside of the use of cage traps. And so we lost that in 96. That was a constitutional amendment in 1996. The statutory one was Initiative 10 in 1992. That was on the bear. And there was a change in the tide about mid 80s or mid 90s. And if you look at the history as far as population census and so forth, about 1980, we had like 1.9 million people in the state. By 1996, we had roughly 2.9 million people. And we're sitting at right around 6 million people right now. So in the last 30 years, gained 3 million people. Now, that might not sound like a lot to some of the eastern states, where you've got a very, very thick, dense population throughout, the state. We've got a very, very dense, thick population through the I-25 corridor from El Paso County, which is Colorado Springs, to Fort Collins.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably to people in the Northeast that may not seem like a lot, but for people in the Southeast, we're very similar, to Colorado and a lot of those other Western states where we have smaller cities, populations of 200,000, something like that. Georgia's probably the closest thing that I can think of in terms of the way Atlanta has just exploded and has, turned Georgia from a solidly red state to a purple state. So I would say that's probably the closest thing. And they've had, huge growth, but it's these urban centers is obviously are most of those people coming from the West, from California and Washington and places like that, or are they coming from all over the country?
All over the country. We see a tremendous growth from the East Coast. For a while, Texans were coming here. The Californians, the Arizonians, the Washingtonians, the Oregonians, that you're moving in. But we get a lot of people from, the Midwest, Ohio and Illinois and, you know, the Indianas, thinking that they're coming to what we had 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy not to do your homework because you come here on vacation, or you come here hunting, or you come here skiing or whatever, and you say, boy, this is just utopia. This is nirvana. This is something I have to have a piece of. Well, Colorado is one of the most beautiful states in the country. We've got some of the most remarkable landscapes and resources. The outdoor recreation with 26 million acres of public land is undeniably some of the best opportunities for people to engage in the outdoors, whether it's nature oriented or otherwise. You know, especially when buddies of mine that live in Indiana and Ohio are talking about hunting 160 acres here and 320 acres there.
Exactly.
This is a different deal. And you know, I guided hunts for the better part of 30 years, and for a first time Eastern hunter to come to the West and, you know, come in on a Friday evening in the dark, you take him into the camp and you wake up at daybreak, you know, before daybreak, and go out. And as the sun comes up, you can see the guy look and go, so where can we hunt to? Well, see that mountain over there? That's about 5.5 miles. And see this mountain over here? That's about 3 miles. And see that mountain over there? That's about another 4 miles. So we can actually hunt probably somewhere around 26 to 50,000 acres on this one ranch. That's not including the public land that would be available.
Right.
And you see the eyes just wide open, you know, like an alligator looking at a flamingo or something. And I think that sort of mentality has spread. And I told guys that, you know, it's funny, I run into guys that I ran into, you know, 30 years ago, and they said, man, I want to move to Colorado. And I said, don't. And it's not, I was trying to keep them out. I said, Colorado is changing, and Colorado is going to continue to change. And some of those guys have moved to Wyoming and Idaho and Montana and North Dakota. And I see them at a convention for a trappers convention or a sportsman show or something. And they like the information or the advice you gave me 30 years ago was the best advice that I could have ever taken from anybody, because I wanted to leave where I was living back east, and I wanted to go to Colorado, and you talked me into going somewhere else. And I'm glad, looking back, that you did, because I see what Colorado has become, and the state that I moved to has not yet.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it started with the spring bear hunting in '92, right? And then where did it go from there?
Then the trapping in '96, organization called Sinapu, which then turned into Wild Earth Guardians, and they got a constitutional amendment ballot initiative that we lost 52 to 48%. Once again, by lies and deceits and a shell game, just like what they did on the bear hunting. And that's what the same mentality, some of the same players 30 years later have helped put this ballot initiative on our plate that we're going to have to fight now for the Lions and the Bobcats. The number is Initiative 91, but it will not be number 91 if they get the signatures to get it on the ballot. So we're just calling it the Colorado hunting ban. And when we're talking to people, we're just saying, you know, explicitly, talk about the Colorado hunting ban, because it's not a trophy hunting ban like what the proponents of the measure allude to. That's what they wanted to call it. But we took that trophy language out of the title. I say we took it out because we spent a ton of money through the Secretary of State, the Supreme Court, and the title board process that was allowed to us. And we got the title changed with trophy hunting out. Trophy hunting still remains in the multi-page measure. But when the voter goes to the ballot, to the poll, and sees what there is, the title itself will say nothing about trophy hunting. It's just a hunting ban. And that's what it always was. It's just that their definition of trophy hunting is a definition of hunting. And I can get into that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I've heard you talk about that in other places. Is essentially when you listen to the definition of it, it's literally hunting. I think they put the word trophy in front of it because it's a messaging tactic, right? As I've heard you talk about this, as I've looked at it, things like that, what I've seen is this is kind of a microcosm of the political climate in general, right? You have hunters and conservationists who have believed in this system for, you know, decades and decades. It's been very productive. It's done an amazing job. You have your extremists on the other side trying to get rid of it, and then you have a lot of uneducated people in the middle that both those sides are trying to to educate, or we're trying to educate, the other side's trying to indoctrinate. And in many cases, they've got a lot more money behind it, which is really why y'all popped up and why you're doing what you're doing in terms of the way you're lobbying, and doing things differently than a lot of the organizations previously, which were more speaking to hunters.
Yeah. And for clarity, I mean, we are the only organization in the state that has full-time lobbying representation for sportsmen and women. We partner with all the acronym groups that we are all members of, whether it's NWTF or RMEF or NWF or you name
right.
them. We've got a coalition of groups together with the Colorado Wildlife Conservation Project that we formed, 23 different organizations in there. But C.R.W.M, the main organization that we're talking about here, is to promote, enhance, and defend the North American model of wildlife conservation and responsible wildlife management. We're not a membership organization. We were formulated to provide education and advocacy for hunting and fishing and conservation efforts, but we don't do magazines, we don't do knives, we don't do any of the stuff that we get when we join all the other organizations. But we do have 3 full-time lobbyists at the Colorado State Capitol. We are engaged through the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission process wholeheartedly to a point to where it's almost nauseating. And the ballot initiative deal is something that we were fully created for, maybe not properly or appropriately prepared for, but in the sense of being able to pull the trigger and have the money in hand when it was immediately necessary because of the timelines in this process. When somebody files a petition to go through the Secretary of State and the title board, you got 2 weeks to make a decision on what you're going to do and how you're going to fight or not fight it. We had the ability within 3 days to push the button, have the funds, hire the campaign managers, hire the legal team to take us through that process, which then lasted 4 months through that initial process. And that's why we were able to put our adversaries on their heels and cause some disruption in their campaign, not only through language, but also timing and their ability to start gathering signatures in a timely manner, which then they have 180 days from when that title is certified. And we were able to do all of that because we were a 501c4, and we didn't need to go through some big, long, drawn-out board process with, people from around the country, and we didn't have a regularly scheduled board, and then you had to figure out what you're going to do with funds. We were created for this sort of stuff, and so we were appropriately prepared. Like I say, maybe not as well as what we'd like to be, but a hell of a lot better than what 99% of the other organizations were.
Was C.R.W.M in place when the Wolf Initiative kicked off a few years ago, or was this largely in response to that tactic? And then can you talk a little bit about, because again, that's something that a lot of people on the East Coast aren't really even aware of, or if they are, it's kind of very little knowledge. So what happened there, how that happened, and then how you've changed, strategy, or at least, are attacking this in a way that the outcome is different.
So, yeah, we were formulated about 3 years prior to the Wolf Initiative, which was to reintroduce wolves to the state of Colorado through a ballot initiative. That was in 2020. And
same process,
so the general public had a same process. Yeah, they went through the title board, Secretary of State, decided we wanted to put wolves on the ground, and by God, that's what they did. I say we, not me, but the opponents or the proponents of those measures.
And what is the rationale from that, from their standpoint, as they we're out talking about it and trying to get the people to vote for this? What was the rationale behind injecting? Well, from what I understand, they brought in Canadian gray wolves, right? Which is completely different than, I think, the wolves that were indigenous to Colorado originally. And so what was the thought process behind all that?
I think there's a difference of opinion. If you listen to the proponents of that measure, it was to instill balance and put an apex predator back on the landscape that had been essentially extirpated out of Colorado, 80, 90 years ago, if not a little bit longer than that. But
and what was the balance? Was the wolf itself
put more
the balance? Because obviously, when you put wolves in place, you're going to significantly impact the ungulate population in terms of calving season and all that stuff. So when they say, put put the balance back in place? Are they just saying put more wolves in place, or do they actually rationalize that that's somehow going to help the rest of the population?
Well, their assumptions or their allegations and innuendos are that that's going to help all of the population. They use Yellowstone as their marketing strategy.
Yellowstone,
which Yellowstone doesn't have 6 million people, and Yellowstone doesn't have cattle, and Yellowstone doesn't have a lot of things that you have on the landscape, public or private land. And but if it really gets down to it, they want more wolves, they want more mountain lions, they want more bears. They don't want predators to be harvested in any way, shape, or form, whether it's a small predator like coyotes or a big predator like wolves. And their balance is that we've screwed it up so bad because we have so much wildlife or so much ungulate growth that it's causing detriment to the stream beds and to the willows and to the landscape. So the more wolves that you had, the less of those ungulates that you had to damage the natural resources. If you really get down to it, and they would never admit this, and they'll argue this all day long, we on a grand scale strongly believe that the more apex predators that you put with protections on the landscape, they all have to eat. That means the less likely that you're going to have hunter opportunity, because you're going to have less and less elk and deer and antelope and bighorn sheep. If you have less deer and elk and antelope and bighorn sheep and moose, then you need less hunters. And if you need less hunters, you need less revenue. And if you need less revenue, then it can be replaced through a tax base. But then I think it's a diabolical trait for them to use smoke and mirrors to say this is the way it was and this is the way it should be. But the way it was when we didn't have 6 million people. And we didn't
when you didn't have a
millions
huge city,
of miles of highway.
Exactly. You didn't have a huge cities. You didn't have millions of miles of highway. Your population was 30% of what it was and less than that before. And the other thing that doesn't track with that whole rationale as I listen to it is, if that was the case, CPW would have put measures in place a long time ago, right? If ungulates were, destroying the vegetation and were impacting fish and game and all those kinds of things. And then B, I guess this is the part too, and I know that it's not a rational argument, but I look at irrational arguments and always get frustrated with them. And I sit there and go, okay, so you want to protect apex predators, but you don't want to protect animals that are essentially defenseless. Like, how do you rationalize that thought process? It seems like it's just a little bit batshit crazy, honestly, in my opinion.
Well, to you and I, it is, but to them, it's nature's balance.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's right.
They don't want us killing the stuff, but it's okay for everything else to kill everything else. But the fact of the matter is, when you argue your point that I am an apex predator, people are on the landscape. This is a part of a societal, emotional component that they want to drive in. Look, since the beginning of time, humanoids have been, feeding themselves in some way, shape, or form, whether it's berries or whether they went out and thumped a woolly mammoth on the head, or they stabbed a saber-toothed tiger, or whatever the hell they did. We've been on this landscape, and I consider me and you and every one of the animal extremists to be part of the ecosystem in some capacity. Somebody has to supply their food, or they supply it for themselves. But if it's their wild for the taking, why am I any different than the wolf? Why am I any different than the lion? Why am I any different than the bear? I don't think.
Why are we any?
That I am.
Why are we any different?
They think that we are.
Why are we any different than the slaughterhouse that they get their meat from at Food Lion or at whatever your supermarket?
Well,
that's
another deal. They're trying to ban slaughterhouses out here too. So
they're just going to go
slaughterhouse ban.
The entire state's going to go vegan. Like how? Like I don't even understand that.
Well, we have a governor that's a vegetarian for the most part, and the first gentleman that's a vegan. And when they got into office, I mean, they had a meat out day to turn around. I think it was beef out is what it was, and then try to get people not to eat beef for a day. Well, the Agriculture and the Cattlemen's Association, threw a shit fit over it. But no, it's imposing my wishes, wants, and desires on somebody else. And look,
it's
I don't care what people
totally
eat.
Ideological.
Yeah, and emotional, because they say that we are killing, no matter how we do it, we're killing cruelly and inhumanely, and we are not doing it morally and ethically, and we're not doing it for any other reason is to have a trophy on our wall like that elk standing behind me on the wall there. They think that is bad. What they don't realize is that was full of meat, and we ate the damn thing,
Exactly.
and I just used the leftovers of it.
Right. I don't know anyone who hunts that
but they
doesn't
don't want
eat
us to
what
do
they
that.
hunt. I don't know one person that hunts that doesn't eat
No.
what they hunt.
And if I decide to harvest a spike or a cow or a 6-point bull, that should be my prerogative. But it's also management driven because of the type of license that I'm allowed to acquire by the game agencies that are managing our wildlife and have been respectfully and sustainably for the last 125 plus years.
And so then it comes down to, I mean, I would assume it comes down to the people in the middle, right? The people who are not necessarily against hunting. They just aren't very knowledgeable about hunting. They don't know much about the North American model of conservation. They really just live in cities, go about their business, have their lives, and they really aren't one way or the other convicted. And then it gets to messaging, right? And it comes down to who's better at messaging. So can you talk a little bit about what their messaging, like what our messaging is, and how you impact those people?
Well, I will take a lot of criticism from our community when I say this, and I've said it over and over. But we, as a sportsman and hunting conservation, hook and bullet, acronym ABC community, all the groups that we're members of have done a piss poor job in the last 40 years of talking to that middle. They've not talked to that middle. They've talked to their potential members. They've talked to their supporters and their sponsors. They've had banquets and fundraisers and endowments. They've not done a very good job of consistently carrying that message. So when you ask what we need to talk about, we're trying to make up lost time because all the predecessors that we've had have not done a very good job of talking to that middle, whether it's predators, whether it's ungulates, whether it's waterfowl, whether it's about the North American model, whether it's about sustainable wildlife populations, whether it's about, the benefits of hunting and fishing to the general public, whether they engage in hunting or not, just so they know that wildlife's on the landscape and it's appropriately managed and it's measured very meticulously. The message that we have right now is trying to convince some of that middle that hunting and angling is a steadfast component of science-based wildlife management. And when it comes to mountain lions and bobcats specifically, you're trying to talk about a very small, low-hanging fruit, a subset of the hunting community. We had 2,500 mountain lion hunters in the state of Colorado last year, harvesting roughly 486 mountain lions for a 19% success rate. We harvested around 900 bobcats with cage traps and with rifles, or maybe the use of hounds to be able to follow and pursue those bobcats and decide if you wanted to harvest that one or not. It's a very small subset of the population. So you're trying to talk to a large segment of the population between the left and the right side, the pro-hunting and the anti-hunting, to convince them why this small group of individuals, the low-hanging fruit individuals, should be able to not only recreate and pursue those two species, but to also help Colorado Parks and Wildlife appropriately manage those highly regulated, highly abundant species. Well, if we'd have been talking about this crap 35 years ago publicly in some capacity, just broadly on 78 game species in Colorado and whatever there is in South Carolina or New York or whatever, we wouldn't have had to turn around and try to beat a dead horse to get something through somebody's head that they haven't paid attention to for the last 30 years. And I think that that's the messaging problem that we've got is every state that is having a ballot initiative this year or a piece of legislation or a petition through their game commission, they should have been talking to the general public in some capacity. The game agencies don't do a very good job. They talk to the hunters and anglers for the most part, and while it's spreading out for a variety of different reasons, it doesn't have to come back to conservation. It doesn't have to come back with wildlife science. It doesn't have to come back with science-based wildlife management. I don't know why we haven't, but we need to figure out a way collectively and uniformly to fix it in the United States. And if we don't, we're going to keep having to do this and educate the general public every 3 or 4 years in every other state about why we don't do what we do or why we do what we do, where we should have been just talking about that in general conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the reasons that it didn't happen is I think it's almost unfathomable when you are in a environment where that is literally the culture that it could ever change, right? And so just to speak for somebody who lives in the state of South Carolina, and it is a very, it's a hunting culture, it's an outdoor culture. We have very small urban areas, a couple 100,000 people max. And so there's really no thought to anyone around here that could ever change. And the thing that really started turning my wheels is, when COVID hit, all of a sudden I started seeing New York, New Jersey license plates showing up in South Carolina all over the place. They are moving down here in droves. And so then I hear something like what you're talking about out there, and I start to go, you know what? I had never thought about it before, but it can change anywhere. And it really just, like you said, we could be doing what you're talking about should have been done, 30, 40 years ago in Colorado. Like I think they said the Southeast, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida are the top 5 states for relocation in the entire country right now. So it's a major concern for me and for the people that I'm starting to talk about. And we're trying to think about, okay, how do we do something like that you're doing right now much more proactively before we start to see our demographic shift significantly?
Yeah, and I think proactive state conversation about messaging in conjunction with national messaging and education. I mean, it's wildlife doesn't know state boundaries, and while
Agreed.
States manage their own wildlife, the North American model of wildlife conservation has an international component to that. That wildlife is an international resource. So things that come from Canada that go through the United States and down to Mexico have similar protections. And so, but the message of that comes up to the state. We ought to be talking about the overall concept of what it takes to sustain wildlife populations as a whole. People in the East have a hard time understanding or comprehending of some of the things that we have to deal with in the West, such as migration. We've got deer herds and elk herds that might travel 50 or 100 miles. I know guys back east that they don't have deer that won't leave within 100 feet of a deer feeder or a soybean field or whatever.
That's right.
And so,
they got their favorite corner they're going to every fall.
Yeah, exactly. We've got landscape changes. We've got climate changes, and I'm not necessarily talking about climate change, but from a 13,000 foot peak to the foothills, to the eastern plains, or to the deserts of the Southwest or the western part of the state, we have a very diversified landscape that game populations migrate in and out of, and they calve in one area, and they summer range in one area, and they winter range in another area, and they might be 100, 150 miles apart. And so when you have this concentrated collection of wildlife in a lot of locations, and you put wolves in, like what we did just last year in 2023 in December, we put the first 10 wolves on the ground. Those wolves are going to start to interact with that migrating population. Well, that migrating population in the wintertime goes to private land where there's agriculture production. So the likelihood of conflict and interaction with apex predators is going to increase because the mountain lions are already doing it. Bears are in hibernation then, but when the bears come out, they go down to the lower elevation and then work their way back up to the higher elevations. There's a component of information and messaging that we don't do. I mean, I remember as a kid, and I think it just started coming back out now. I just saw an advertisement for it. I remember as a kid, every Sunday night, I used to run inside to watch Mutual Omaha's Wild Kingdom with Marlon Perkins. I mean, that was you didn't have to go look for it on one of 3,000 different cable channels or streaming networks. It was on network television, and it was there every Sunday night. And then, but ironically, then Walt Disney came on, on Sunday night. And so we had this ideology, this Disneyfication of one side that was anthropomorphized, and then the other side that was real life stuff of Marlon Perkins out there, trying to wrangle a crocodile or study a lion or something. We were brought up with that sort of stuff. The kids today are not, but everybody loves wildlife. Everybody likes to know about wildlife. They like to see wildlife, whether they go to the zoo whether they go on out in the field on the landscape. And we just haven't done a very good job of explaining how conservation has worked with 375 million people in the United States, and how our forefathers from the late 1800s to the early 1900s established guidelines of which we adhere to today, which now we refer to as the North American model. We should be indoctrinating people to at least know the facts and the fallacies about science-based wildlife management, as opposed to, in my opinion, saying, here's a magazine, double up your membership, triple up your membership, and you get a free knife. Okay, how about let's take some of that money that we get and put it in a giant pool for every organization to come together and say, we're going to run commercials during the holiday season, just like the ASPCA does or the Humane Society of the United States does. And we're going to show the world about conservation, about science-based wildlife management. And it has to do with hunting and fishing and the successes of those models that were created, a century and a quarter ago.
Is Howl the largest organization that focuses on that, or what's Howl's mission, or is that mostly like mission driven towards blunting actions like this? Are they doing a significant amount of education around that, or what does that look like in terms of? I know they've helped y'all some, but what are they doing?
So
is that part of their
my
mission?
work with Charles, that's my inner working relationship with Charles Whitwam, Mike Costello, and John Stallone with Howl for Wildlife has been nothing other than remarkable. I mean, it just kind of flourished out of nothing, just like planting a seed in a field. And their mission has been to support the efforts that what we're doing in the short term, but in the long term, they deal with the legislative, the commission-driven, citizens petition, education of the general public, allowing them to know what is happening with their game commissions and with their general assemblies to get sportsmen and women involved. Now, while they do a little bit of messaging to the general public, they haven't gotten into, to the best of my knowledge or what I've seen, and if Charles listens to this, I'm going to see him this next weekend, so I hope he doesn't slap the crap out of me. But they're not talking to the general public. Maybe so, but I got to stay my distance because him and Mike and John together, all together, I'd have to worry about.
Yeah, you get teamed up on, right? That would be a hard one.
Yeah. But they are talking to the sportsmen to get the sportsmen and women engaged about the process and the procedure and the requirements of sustaining outreach and messaging and letting elected officials know of your positions or your concerns or your recommendations or your curiosities. And I think while they would love to be able to get into a larger, broader level of outreach and education, this is the hardest landscape that we as sportsmen have to deal with. Is we have to fight the fight to educate a fallacy-driven smoke and mirrors campaign at a variety of different levels, whether it's about hound hunting, whether it's about bighorn sheep, or maybe it's about turkeys, or maybe it's about predators. We have to fight that, and then we still have to try to go outside of our wheelhouse and educate the general public about other things in a proactive, offensive, not offensive, but offensive manner, as opposed to sitting back and waiting for the next ballot initiative or the next piece of legislation and going, now we have to thwart the campaign of our opposition, and we're supposed to educate and inform over here. Those are things that we should have done, in my mind, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and build that mechanism out of these associations and create that component. And I know that a lot of them are figuring out a way to turn around and start to do that in some capacity. But, when your enemy has been building up their war chest and their armament for 40 years, and you've been building up yours for another reason, but not to do the attack and the assault defense component, you're behind the eight ball by, damn near a half a century. And
I was going to say, isn't a significant amount of the money that's coming in to Colorado for these ballot initiatives, they're coming from large financial groups, right? That are not even inside the state of Colorado, that are, big national, I don't know if PITA is part of it, but organizations like that. Is that how much of that funding is coming from out of state from those larger organizations?
Significant. I mean, in the upper 80 to 90 percentile. of the big stuff. Now, what I will say is that our adversaries are going to say, yeah, but they're gaining money from outside too, out of their state too. We are. We've gained revenue far from 6 Canadian provinces, all 50 states of the U.S., several foreign countries. But I want to preface that with 95% of the people or the entities or organizations that have contributed to our campaign to help defeat this measure have skin in the game in Colorado because they hunt here, they recreate here, they own property here, some of their businesses are here. And so when you've got 252,000 non-resident hunters that are applying for licenses as we speak, our deadline here for applications is April 2nd. When they're applying for licenses because they have preference points or they're trying to hunt a specific area or they're going with an outfitter, maybe they're hunting with their uncle from Fort Collins and going on a family trip, they have skin in the game. So $20 to $50 to them is a small investment. So the grassroots efforts that we've been able to build off of this is nothing less than remarkable. But it's not giant organizations of anti-extremism that are funding what the opposition is funding. It's not, I mean, all of our national groups are kicking in, but they've got members in this state that actually buy licenses and support conservation efforts and the wildlife management objectives of our agency.
Are the national groups, are they starting to make larger contributions and really starting to recognize the importance of the fight, or are they still largely kind of in a silo in terms of, speaking to their members?
I have to give kudos to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. Not only have they contributed financially and helped through the initial process, in state they've helped through their outreach of their banquets and their fundraisers, and actually have had our literature, our videos. We've had a chance to speak at multiple events. If we haven't been able to speak there, they've spoke for us while still handing out our literature and showing our videos. The Safari Club International, specifically the Colorado chapter of Safari Club, the Four Corners chapter, the Denver chapter of Safari Club have all kicked in financially, very substantially. The Wild Sheep Foundation has kicked in, the Rocky Mountain Bighorn Society, Colorado Bowhunters Association, Muley Fanatics Foundation, National Wild Turkey Federation. They're kicking in. But understand that when this thing dropped in September of last year, most of these organizations that I mentioned are 501c3s. And so they have a yearly budget, just like any other business or any other, most homeowners or, residential people have a budget. This was not incorporated into their budget. They had to figure out a way to either dip into their reserve or plan for the 24 budget. And some of them might even be on a fiscal year as opposed to a calendar year. So you're trying to work through the hoops and hurdles of their structures. But when you get $1,000 donation from a guy in Pennsylvania or a $250 donation from an alligator trapper in Florida, or a guy that says, I'm giving you $20 a week because that's all I can afford, and he puts it on his credit card to go on the website that it's withdrawn from his account, every week, or you get $100,000 donation from an individual in Connecticut that has, major property holdings and business interest in Colorado. This is from the top to the bottom, north, south, east, and west. And it's just pretty remarkable to see the outreach because people see not only the sense of urgency, but the need because of the way that this is written. This is a mountain lion and a bobcat issue. Even though lynx are included and they can't be harvested, they included them in case they're ever to be delisted. But the thing I want to emphasize with this is a setting in stone, a statutory definition of trophy hunting. Even though trophy hunting is not in the ballot title, it's in the ballot language. And the reason that's important is because statutory is different than regulatory. And once it's in statute, it can be used as a precedent, not only in this state, but other states as well, and maybe even federally, because it's in the statute. Statutory definition of trophy hunting will become, if this passes, to intentionally kill, wound, stalk, entrap, pursue a mountain lion or a bobcat. Intentionally kill. or pursue or stalk. That is hunting. That is not trophy hunting.
Right, which then opens the door to
that's
put
the
same
definition.
Language in place for anything else that you want to try to eliminate hunting.
Elk, bighorn sheep. There was an article last fall by Trish Zornio with the Colorado Sun that stated, why are bighorn sheep any different than mountain lion? Why are we hunting the state animal? That's before this thing even really took full form at all. They're already planting the seed. When the governor starts a contest for grade school kids to name the wolves that they're going to drop on the ground in December, and then they pick the names instead of 006 or M14 or whatever it might be. Now they've got the wolves named, and when those wolves were let out, this one is Maverick, and this one is Tommy, and this one is whatever. How'd you like to be the first guy that has to protect his livestock, and he has to shoot Maverick instead of shooting M006?
And now you got
this is a psyche mentality.
Yeah, it's an indoctrination of the youth.
It's an indoctrination, and it's something to where we haven't appropriately addressed since the Disneyfication when I was a kid. And if you look at the way the language is written, it's intentionally put in there so it can be a smoke and mirrors campaign. We get the low-hanging fruit. We tell people it's about mountain lions and bobcats, when in all reality, it's much broader. It's much bigger because of the definition. And one thing people need to pay attention to, the statutory inclusion of this in the measure, it talks about electronic collars for dogs, tracking devices for dogs. And I've talked to houndsmen that are like, well, how are we supposed to do this? Well, the fact of the matter is they don't want you to do any of it. But then you look at upland game bird hunters, waterfowl hunters, raccoon hunters, rabbit hunters, stock dogs. They all use training collars because it's efficient and it's effective, and it keeps the animal in control, especially with private property and different species and different seasons that you have to be able to adhere to and so forth. Those are tools of the trade to help manage the cruelty or the inhumaneness that somebody would allege, because you can actually keep the dog in check. The dog can't go where the dogs are not supposed to go. You're using it as a training device. I've got training collars on my dogs that I use for my wildlife control business. I don't even have to use them anymore, but they're on them because the dog knows that I should go do this, so I'm not chasing that. So I don't go over here, so I can stay over there. That would be in the statute. And that would also set a precedent to where you get rid of the mountain lion hunters, you get rid of the bobcat hunters and the hounds, and the use of collars and tracking devices. What are they going to go to next? Upland birds, waterfowl, stock dogs.
I mean, if you take collars off of animals, what are all these people who have wireless fences going to do? I mean,
that's the thing.
You know what I'm saying? It's like there's no end to the conversation in terms of, it's very broad language that allows you to continually be more and more restrictive.
I say that their intent is to weasel in a statutory definition with many, many components of that is being overlooked through this whole process. That if it's regulation, it's much harder to turn around and emulate or duplicate. If it's statutory, it's much easier for 100 legislators or somebody to turn around and put another ballot together that they can duplicate that, because this is the precedent that was set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So that's their messaging, right? So in terms of the messaging that we're getting out, what is the strategy, and how are we getting that messaging out to the middle in terms of educating them and teaching them, helping them understand, the North American model, and helping them understand, the idea that just about everyone out there that is harvesting an animal is actually eating that meat, which is actually better than going to the store and because it's half of the stuff that they don't like that's happening in the store. I mean, this is something that we've been doing for thousands of years, right? Versus some of this industrial farming that they say they don't like. So how do we get that message across to the person who's going to make the vote that matters?
Well, in the immediate future, we're still talking to, for the most part, the stakeholder, the guy, the hook and bullet guy, the hunter and angler, the sportsman and woman, because we're trying to build a war chest up to where we can fund the effort to be able to talk to target audience, that in the win crowd. So while somebody won't see a lot of advertising coming out right now to talk to that target, because it's not a ballot measure, they're still gathering signatures to get it on the ballot because of the proactive measures that we already took. They've got until July 5th to gather those signatures. And so our message at this point in time is talking about the facts, talking about the data, talking about the statistics, talking about the tradition and the heritage. And if anybody goes to our Instagram page, which is c.r.w.m, or they go to the Facebook page, which is the Coloradans for Responsible Wildlife Management, or if they go to the Save the Hunt Colorado.com, which I'll further emphasize, they can see
that's
what we're
they
doing
can
to
donate,
talk to the
right?
stakeholder.
People can donate.
That's where they can donate.
Colorado.com. Yeah.
Yep, they can donate, and they can also, since we mentioned, they can also enter into 2 raffle drawings, one for a mountain lion hunt and a full body mount, taxidermy mount, or a Gunworks rifle and scope. Both of those packages, you just click on the button and it takes you to the SCI Colorado chapter website, and they can purchase tickets for that. All of the funding that is generated from those go to this fight. Or if they don't want to get into the raffle stuff, they can turn around and just donate on the donate button. But those 3 sources of information are primarily built to the target audience in a very minimal level, but to the stakeholder audience now. Professional done messaging.
Mm-hmm.
Colorado Wildlife Deserve Better is the issue committee. Colorado Wildlife Deserve Better. The website is Wildlife Deserve Better. That's the issue committee that has to be formulated in Colorado to be able to have a campaign. If you look at Colorado Wildlife Deserve Better, you can see some of the messaging that is going to that target audience. So there's a dual prong approach with what we're doing. One is the stakeholder side. The other one is the target audience side. Both of them will cross and intersect to some degree, but one is specifically built 7 years ago. The other one was just built in January. When the ballot is done in November, Colorado Wildlife Deserve Better will fall off, and C.R.W.M, Coloradans for Responsible Wildlife Management, will continue trudging along, working in the trenches. Dual purpose, same message, 2 different audiences, because as we spoke about here, educating our side is just as important as educating the middle of the road. And I don't give a rat's ass about the educating the other side, because the other side doesn't care about anything that we or you or RMEF or NWTF has to say, because we're all wrong. We're all a bunch of heathens. We're all a bunch of knuckle dragging Neanderthals. I don't care what that 10 or 12% over there says. We care about the middle of the road, and we care about our side, and our side needs to figure out a way to help us win this, so we can help build a roadmap and a playbook to where when they come to your state, whether it's Tennessee or South Carolina or Montana or wherever, we've already gotten a proven track record from a national campaign that has kicked the crap out of the opposition, that is trying to take every single part of it away in some capacity, piece by piece. Once they build a puzzle, they're going to go through every state that they could possibly go through. And it might not be in my lifetime, but if they do it slow enough and steady enough, they can accomplish a lot if we don't put up a formidable defense.
So I would imagine that the way that most people can help the best is to help build up that war chest, right? Is to donate and to, I think, I can't remember. I watched the Ranella podcast, and I think one of the guys on there said if every person who was applying for an elk tag in Colorado sent in $20, it would be like $4 million or something.
$4 million.
If everyone sent in 50, then it would be 10 million. So, I mean, that's what people need to do, right? Is people need to contribute, regardless of where you live. I mean, I would just say, regardless of what state you live in, just like you said a minute ago, what we are doing here is trying to establish a way to combat this kind of political action against our way of life, against the North American model, and to basically create a pathway so that when these things start to happen in other states, we've got a track record. Well, you can't establish a track record without funding. And so to me, that's the most important thing to do, right? And I guess, where do they do that? At the website?
They do that at the website at SaveTheHuntColorado.com. And people need to understand that you contributing to our campaign is helping us accomplish a victory. But it also helps us accomplish a strategy and a playbook. With all BS aside, we have been contacted by over 30 or 40 different individuals. Can you help us in Wisconsin? Are you forming something in Arizona? What can you do in Florida? We have problems in North Dakota. This is not a singular effort. Our efforts have started out in the Centennial State because this is where we live, and this is the roadmap that we have to play by, the rules of engagement. However, if we defeat them here with this, it's a proven strategy because it's not a Colorado strategy. It's a American strategy. It's a North American strategy. It's something that we can build off of collectively because all of the groups that we're all members of, whether it's from the trapping community of the National Trappers Association or Fur Takers of America, or the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, or the White-tailed Deer Association, or the Mule Deer Association, those are national organizations that have representation from each individual state. We have the structure there. We just have to figure out a way to put position players in the right position. And we are trying to help formulate that because we see the need to do it, because we couldn't do this on our own here in Colorado. I mean, we don't have enough in-state hunters to turn around and help fund this for an out-of-state juggernaut that is sending mega dollars in from all around the country. This has to be an effort of individuals that have an interest in our state, but also an interest in their state, because look what's happening in Pennsylvania. Look what's happening in Arizona, Washington, Oregon, Montana. Everybody's got something going on at some level. If we can establish this sphere of continuity amongst all of these other groups, create this net to broaden our horizons, I honestly believe that in a shorter period of time than what we have accomplished, we can do something bigger, better, meaner, faster, stronger, collectively, collaboratively, to make sure that we are all on the same page in some capacity to fight maybe what it is in Virginia or maybe what it is in Nevada. Build that war chest up and build the playbook up. We're getting support from the industry. We're getting support from the NGO community, the non-governmental associations that I mentioned. We're getting support from individuals, landowners, business owners, manufacturers. They see the need. We just had to figure out a way to commingle our efforts on a grand scale. And for the generosity that guys like you and Ranella and Cameron Haynes and Joe Rogan and everybody talking about things and trying to get things lined up, and the smaller guy, the middle guy, the big guy, everybody sees how important this is. And I think that if we establish our flag in the sand, draw a line in the concrete and not in the sand, we can actually do something that is nothing less than remarkable, but something that our forefathers envisioned that what they created would be able to be sustained in perpetuity. And then we're on the brink of maybe losing that if we don't put our stuff in the same toolbox and figure out what tools each one of us can use.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're doing is amazing. I would just encourage everybody, listen, it's nothing for us to stop at Sportsman's Warehouse and drop $200. It's nothing for us to go, on somebody's website and drop $100. Spend $50, $100 and send it out to C.R.W.M. so that we can impact Colorado, yes, but also, like you said, set a playbook for our states so we can actually establish some of these big, catch up on the 40 or 50 years that some of these big anti-hunting organizations have kind of ingrained themselves in. We need to start doing that so that we have proactive measurements and proactive organizations so that, like you said, we can take that model, spread it out to other states, and we can combat this on a national scale and save the way of life that we all really, really love. So one more time, savethehuntcolorado.com to donate, crwc.r.w.m on Instagram. And Dan, thank you so much for being here, brother. It was a pleasure and an honor to have you, man.
Appreciate the opportunity. Look forward to updating you and through the process, or maybe after the victory. And as I always say, aim small, miss small, stay the course, and may the force be with you at this point in time.